Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for coming to my session. And I'd like to thank the British Council Mexico for inviting me to do a plenary session. It's a great honor and privilege, and I'm extremely grateful for being given this opportunity. I'm going to be talking about empathy and empathy in language education. Before I actually go into the main part of my talk, I'm going to tell you about some events in my life and career which are related to empathy, and then refer back to them in my talk. So I was born in Birmingham, England. My parents were both Irish immigrants who moved to England because there were no jobs or opportunities for them in Ireland. They met in Birmingham, got married and had 6 children. And we grew up in a multicultural working class area with a large, close-knit Irish community. And our childhood was very happy. But when I was 2, I had a serious kidney disorder and was hospitalized on several occasions for many months. When I came out of hospital, I seemed to be traumatized by the experience. I was afraid of many things and had a stammer. I continued to have problems with my kidneys, and the doctors wanted me to have a colostomy bag. When I was 5, one day after school, my teacher, Miss Askew, took my mother and myself to the cloakroom, and she said to me, "Do it, Kieran." And I sang the lullaby, Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, without stammering. I imagine most of you will know this lullaby. My mother was amazed and she was in floods of tears. Miss Askew had spent her breaks and lunchtimes teaching me the lullaby and helped me overcome my stammer. Both my stammer and kidney problem eventually disappeared. After secondary school, I went to university and then went on to do my initial teacher training. And one of my first jobs was at a college in Birmingham, where I was able to teach fascinating students from around the world who spoke many different languages and who needed English to work on projects abroad for their NGOs. In the staff room at the college, I discovered Joe Hatfield's resource book, Classroom Dynamics, which had interesting humanistic techniques, many of which fostered empathy. I also discovered the work of Carl Rogers and Earl Stevick's book, Teaching Languages, Away and Ways, where I read his famous dictum. And you've got the dictum here. I'm sure many of you will be familiar with it, but many of you it will also be new to you. So I'll just give you a moment to look at that. So this dictum had a strong influence on my teaching throughout my career, and I always related it in some way to empathy. Subsequently, I was lucky enough to live and work in a number of countries and learn a number of languages. Language teaching has been very kind to me, and I've met wonderful teachers and taught thousands of lovely, enthusiastic students. However, at various points in my career, I've considered leaving the profession because of the long hours, low pay, and precarity. When I was working very long days, there were times I became frustrated at myself for not being as patient or empathetic to students as I knew I could be. But I persevered and taught full-time for almost 30 years. The last 12 years of which were spent teaching older students aged from 60 to 85. So I feel fortunate to have chosen teaching as a career. So all of these experiences I've just explained have contributed to my interest in empathy, and I'm going to revisit them during the talk. Here we have an overview of the session, what I'm going to be doing, what we're going to be exploring in the next 40 minutes. We're going to look at what empathy is. It's quite a complex construct, and we're going to unpack it a little bit. We're going to look at the neurological foundations of empathy. We're going to explore why empathy is important in society, education in general, and language education in particular. We're going to explore the characteristics of an empathic teacher, and we're going to explore if there is an empathy deficit in language education, and finally we're going to look at practical ways that we can foster empathy in our classes. Okay, so first of all, we're going to define empathy, which is a complex construct, and it's got several components. And I'm going to use Roman Krznarik's definition, which I think is particularly nuanced and recognizes the multiple components of empathy. And here you have the definition. The first part is a cognitive part. That's the recognition or understanding part, so stepping imaginatively into the shoes of another person. So the cognitive part is the drive to identify what another person might be thinking or feeling. So it's about putting yourself in someone else's shoes and imagining what's going on in their minds. So the cognitive component is about perspective taking. The second component is affective, understanding their feelings and perspectives. So it's the emotional reaction to somebody else's thoughts and feelings. So the affective component is about shared emotional response. Both the cognitive component and the affective component must be combined to create the third component, which we have. So empathic concern involves the will for action, the will to do something for the other person. So cognitive and affective empathy alone are not enough for pro-social behaviors. Parent-child attachment is key in the formation of empathy, and children must have experienced empathic treatment themselves if they are in turn to develop empathy. And children who haven't been nurtured and experienced empathic behavior are more likely to develop into less morally aware adults. Carl Rogers argued that experience but not brilliance improves empathy. So Rogers believed that empathy can potentially be developed by training. And there's an overwhelming consensus among the experts that we can develop our empathic potential throughout our lives. So our empathy is not fixed. It's something which we can develop. So having defined empathy and looked at its various components, we now need to explore the neurological foundations of empathy. And to do this, we'll look at two moments of scientific serendipity. And the first moment of scientific serendipity relates to Phineas Gage, who was a railway foreman in the USA in the 19th century. And he used a metal rod to push dynamite down to create explosions before he and his laborers laid the railway track. One day, the dynamite went off early and blew the pole right up underneath his eye and through his brain, as you can see in the illustration. Incredibly, Gage survived the accident. Before the accident, he was described as a polite, courteous, and considerate person. But after the accident, he was described as impulsive and rude, unable to judge what was socially appropriate. His memory and language weren't affected, but his empathy seemed to have been. More than 100 years later, the Portuguese neuroscientist Hania Damasio was able to obtain Gage's brain, which had been preserved in a vat, and put it into an MRI scanner and see exactly where the location of the damage was. And she discovered that it was in the left ventral medial prefrontal cortex, which you can see in the illustration here. And the involvement of the left ventral medial prefrontal cortex in empathy is now well confirmed by neuroscience, but it's not the only region involved in empathy. And now we'll look at the second moment of scientific serendipity, which relates to Giacomo Rizzolatti at the University of Parma in Italy in 1990, when he accidentally discovered mirror neurons while conducting experiments in the F5 brain region of monkeys. He recorded that a particular region of the premotor cortex was activated when a monkey picked up a peanut. Then, completely by accident, he noticed that the same region lit up when the monkey happened to see a researcher pick up a nut, even though the monkey hadn't moved an inch. The brain had responded as if the monkey had grasped the nut itself. Subsequent brain imaging experiments have shown that the inferior frontal cortex and the superior parietal lobe are active when the person performs an action, and also when the person sees another individual performing an action. So it's been suggested that these brain regions contain mirror neurons, and I'm sure most of you have heard of mirror neurons. However, mirror neurons are just the beginning of the empathic brain, and it's important to understand that there's no simple empathy center in the brain, and that mirror neurons are just part of a much more complex empathy circuit comprising 14 different but interconnected brain regions, which you can see in the illustration here. So when we empathize with another person, this network of regions is activated. I think that these neurological insights remind us what an extraordinary and complex capacity empathy is. So we now need to turn to why empathy is important in society. In his book, The Empathic Civilization, economic and social theorist Jeremy Rifkin argues that empathy is the universal human trait that holds society together. Empathy is also vital for a healthy democracy. It ensures we listen to different perspectives and we hear and feel other people's emotions. David Howe of the University of East Anglia in the UK believes that without empathy, democracy would not be possible. And I think that we're seeing this in many parts of the world, that empathy, where empathy doesn't exist or is reduced greatly, democracy is much more difficult. Given the importance of empathy in society, its rapid decline, at least in the West, which Barack Obama has called the empathy deficit, is alarming. A study by Conrath, O'Brien and Singh at the University of Michigan in 2010 revealed a dramatic decline in empathy levels among college students between 1980 and 2010, with the steepest drop being after the year 2000. So college students in the US today demonstrate about 40% less empathy than their counterparts of 20 or 30 years ago. And the researchers think a number of factors may be responsible for this empathy deficit. One factor is more people living alone and spending less time engaged in social and community activities which nurture empathy. Another factor is the increased use of technology and the rise of social media. And a third factor is the hyper-competitive social environment and inflated expectations of success. So now we're just going to explore why empathy is important in education. So in recent years, educators have increasingly expressed the importance of emotions and the development of empathy as part of moral development in education. And Daniel Goleman, the author of the best-selling book Emotional Intelligence, argues that emotional intelligence goes hand in hand with moral development. Research shows that in all educational settings, high quality relationships between the teacher and learners and among learners are essential for successful learning. So empathy is essential in creating these quality relationships and would appear to be central to all successful learning and development. The child advocate Mary Gordon captures the centrality of empathy and high quality relationships we form with our learners when she writes, "To teach children, we must first reach them." And when I read this quote, this reminded me of my primary school teacher, Miss Askew, who I mentioned in my introduction, who taught me, helped me to overcome my stammer by teaching me the lullaby. And so in this case, she reached me before she was able to teach me. So having looked at why empathy is essential in education, we now need to explore the characteristics of empathic teachers. And I'm going to refer to the characteristics of teacher empathy proposed by Bridget Cooper of the University of Sunderland in the UK. And according to Cooper, the characteristics of teacher empathy fall into three broad areas. There's functional empathy, fundamental empathy, and profound empathy. And we're going to look at each one at each of these three types of empathy in turn. So we're going to look first at functional empathy. And functional empathy is demonstrated when teachers create a mental model of a group of students. So functional empathy can be divided into three categories. We'll look at those three categories now. The first is group empathy and whole class relationship. So to use functional empathy, teachers need to have a rich social, emotional, and academic understanding of a whole group of students. And the second refers to rules, fairness, and manners. So another feature of functional empathy is the establishment of fair and reasonable group rules and good manners between the teacher and students. And the third is mental grouping. So while using functional empathy, teachers often categorize students into different types and groups in order to assess them and cater for their needs. So there are a number of conclusions that we can draw about functional empathy. Functional empathy is absolutely essential in the classroom, as it provides cohesion and security, it creates understanding and a positive group climate. However, a teacher who only uses functional empathy doesn't cater to the needs of individual students who don't conform to the group stereotype. So most teachers try to supplement this functional empathy with fundamental empathy and profound empathy for individual students. And we're going to look at fundamental empathy now. And so fundamental empathy is needed to initiate empathic relationships, and it can be observed in the type of social interaction that most people use to engage in conversations and relationships with others in daily life. And it can be divided into two main areas: the initial characteristics and the means of communication. We're just going to have a look first at the initial characteristics. So acceptance and openness is a vital starting point in empathic relationships. The teachers accept students as they find them, and by being open themselves and sharing their own experiences, teachers eventually learn more about the students. Focused sole attention between the teacher and students maximizes engagement, communication, and learning. And empathic teachers listen and value individual students by hearing their perspective. Showing interest makes the student feel valued and worthy. And empathic teachers directly praise students, and direct praise is particularly important for students from minority groups and students with special educational needs or specific learning difficulties who may receive little praise elsewhere in the educational system. And finally, empathic teachers are enthusiastic about both their subject and their relationship with students. Now we're going to look at the means of communication. The empathic attitudes of teachers that I've just described need to be clearly communicated, or they wouldn't have any effect. So classroom teachers commonly emphasize their facial and bodily expressions. So teachers who practice fundamental empathy are aware of the importance of clear facial expression. So eye contact is especially significant as it leads to immediate and meaningful communication. Using eye contact as a means of communication is obviously much easier in face-to-face, in-person classes than it is in online classes. And teachers also watch their students' facial expressions carefully to gauge response and understanding. And again, gauging students' facial expression as a means of communication is much easier in in-person classes than it is in online classes. So teachers who practice fundamental empathy are aware of the importance of gesture, body language, and movement. And again, reading gesture, body and body language is much easier in in-person classes. Teachers who practice fundamental empathy feel relationships and learning improve when they can get closer to students. So physical closeness can produce emotional closeness and promotes caring and sharing. So this physical closeness is obviously only possible in in-person classes. And empathic teachers use appropriate language which doesn't mystify or confuse students. And the empathic teachers are aware of the importance of voice tone and, for example, mirror quiet students by speaking gently and thoughtfully. So there are a number of conclusions that we can draw about fundamental empathy. Fundamental empathy initiates the interactive relationships that support engagement, interaction, and learning. The active listening and interest of the empathic teacher begins this engagement with the other person, which over time can develop into emotional attachment. And the enthusiasm of these teachers begins to engage students at an emotional level in learning. And now we're going to turn to profound empathy. And Bridget Cooper contends that profound empathy is of a higher order than functional empathy or fundamental empathy, as its characteristics show deeper and broader levels of understanding, which are associated with closer and longer lasting relationships. So what are the characteristics of profoundly empathic teachers? So according to Bridget Cooper, the first characteristic is that of developing positive emotions and interactions. Profoundly empathic teachers act to create positive emotions. They realize that positive personal interaction needs sole attention and individual quality time. And they make time for these interactions with students before and after class, in breaks, at lunchtimes, and after school. In my introduction, I mentioned my primary school teacher, Miss Askew, and she somehow found the time to teach me how to sing the lullaby, Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, and help me overcome my speech impediment while teaching 30 other students. So Miss Askew is an example of a time giver who gave sole attention. And I think throughout the pandemic, teachers showed that they are time givers. Profoundly empathic teachers are aware of the importance of knowing themselves and of trying to get inside their students' thinking and feelings. These teachers remember their own reactions and their own children's reactions to teachers. When I was teaching children, I'd often think about how my primary school teachers treated me, or ask myself how I would like a teacher to treat my own children, and this guided my actions. When I taught older adult learners, I would think I would like a teacher to treat my own 92-year-old mother, and this guided my actions. And I'm sure most of you do something very similar. Profoundly empathic teachers lay great stress on the importance of relationships in teaching and learning, and they feel high quality relationships set secure boundaries and enable good communication and interaction. Profoundly empathic teachers empathize deeply with a wide range of students, and they build up an encyclopedic knowledge of all students. Profoundly empathic teachers take responsibility for the well-being of students as well as their academic development. And profoundly empathic teachers are highly adaptive, and they're aware of the different roles they adopt with different students. They build very rich mental models of their students, and they develop deep attachments with their students. And finally, profoundly empathic teachers try to be good people, to do the right thing, and to support others. The moral behavior of the teacher is often mirrored by students. So this moral aspect of profound empathy was shown by teachers throughout the pandemic, when they were compassionate and generous to their students. So there are a number of conclusions that we can draw about profound empathy. Profoundly empathic teachers are considerate, unselfish, caring, kind, and pleasant. Their empathic and caring behavior engenders similar behavior in their students. And profound empathy helps to produce what Bridget Cooper calls the constant human dialogue necessary for learning to take place. And I think this is important, this constant human dialogue, which is necessary for learning to take place. When we explore the literature, profound empathy reminds us of Carl Rogers' synonym for empathy, sensitive understanding, and his concept of unconditional positive regard for the other. It also reminds us of Olstevik's presence of empathy in the classroom, which I mentioned in my introduction. And profound empathy's soul, attention, and deep attachment resemble Nell Nodding's engrossment and Iris Murdoch's loving attention that promotes moral development. Now, we need to explore why empathy is particularly important in language education. As we've already seen, empathy and high quality relationships are central to all successful learning and development. However, I would say that in contemporary language classes where communicative competence is a central goal, and which use communicative language teaching and learner-centered approaches, which are highly social and interpersonal in nature, high-quality relationships are particularly important. In 2016, Christina Gonneau and Sarah Mercer, along with the British Council, carried out the first large-scale study on the emotional and social intelligence of English language students across the globe. The results of the qualitative survey revealed that English language teachers generally scored highly on the emotional and social intelligence scales. One possible reason for the high scores could be that most language teachers are bilingual, trilingual, or polyglots, and research shows that bilinguals, trilinguals, polyglots have higher levels of empathy than monolinguals, and empathy is a key component of social and emotional intelligence. I mentioned in the introduction that teaching has allowed me to learn a number of languages, and I feel this has increased my empathy, and I'm sure many of you also feel that learning a language has helped you to develop your empathy. Gonneau and Mercer's qualitative research findings showed that the majority of teachers emphasized the importance of having meaningful, high-quality relationships with their students, and they pointed to 4 characteristics of these high-quality relationships: respect, trust, responsiveness, and empathy. And empathy was the most mentioned characteristic of meaningful, high-quality relationships with students. Nearly all of the teachers mentioned empathy directly or indirectly. So the key to achieving these meaningful, high quality relationships with our students and other teachers is our capacity to empathize. Given the increasingly multicultural and multilingual nature of the language classroom in many parts of the world, language teachers and learners need to develop intercultural skills, and empathy has a vital role to play in promoting intercultural competence, which is a key facet of communicative competence. And as you can see here, as Gonneau and Mercer argue, nurturing empathy can increase learners' awareness, understanding, and appreciation of other cultures. And as Bridget Cooper argues, empathy is even more important in the ESL classroom, where students often feel inadequate as they've gone from feeling confident and competent in classrooms in their own countries to classrooms in a foreign country where communication may be very difficult or even impossible. So to boost the self-confidence and self-esteem of ESL students, the teacher needs a huge amount of sensitivity and empathy. So In some, as Sarah Mercer contends, empathy is particularly important in language education because of its focus on communication, social interactions, and cultural diversity. Now, when we looked at the importance of empathy in society, I refer to what Barack Obama has termed the empathy deficit. We're now going to explore if an empathy deficit exists in language education. I believe that language teachers are aware of the importance of empathy in successful learning and want to be and try to be empathic. And undoubtedly, one of the most effective ways of embedding a culture of empathy in language education is for teachers to act as role models of an empathic and moral person. However, there are a number of factors which may hinder teachers' abilities to be empathic and for us to embed a culture of empathy. You'll probably already be aware of these factors. Perhaps it's the first time you've heard them related to the construct of empathy. So what are these hindering factors? One hindering factor is the exclusion of certain groups of people from course books. Many of you will already know the Parsnips acronym, which stands for just a few of the many taboo subjects in ELT course books. The reasons publishers censor material is that they want to sell books in as many markets as possible, and they don't want to upset local sensibilities. However, I would argue that the Parsnips approach is fundamentally flawed. As Amir Garmoudi contends, it's based on a one-size-fits-all method of content creation. It's certainly economic, but it's not necessarily ethical because it excludes and others many people as it denies their experiences, life choices and belief systems, and may make it more difficult for students to empathize with these people. I believe that all of us, teachers, trainers, managers, writers, and publishers, need to be braver and to push for more inclusivity in ELT materials. A recent initiative from Brazil to make ELT course books more inclusive is Raise Up by Ilan Coimbra and James Taylor, which is a course book which represents groups of people such as working class people, homosexuals, indigenous people, refugees, the elderly and disabled, who've traditionally been excluded from course books. Another hindering factor is native speakerism, which Sylvana Richardson spoke about eloquently and passionately in her seminal IATEFL plenary in Birmingham in 2016. During my career, many of the very best teachers I've met have been non-native English-speaking teachers. However, there's still widespread discrimination in recruitment and conditions of this group of teachers. I think there has to be equity for native and non-native teachers of English. TEFL Equity Advocates is an organization set up by Marek Kishovek, which fights to achieve this equity. As Marek argues, both native and non-native speakers can be equally good teachers. Those of us in the profession who are native speakers of English should empathize and imagine what it feels like to be a person who has learned English to a high level, studied pedagogy at university, pursued professional development, and then to be rejected for a job or receive a worse salary and conditions because their native language is not English. A general hindering factor is the undervaluing of teachers, which Paula Rebolledo referred to in her excellent IATEFL plenary on teacher empowerment in Liverpool in 2019. Teachers feel undervalued, and teacher morale is a major problem. In the UK, 50% of teachers leave the profession within the first 5 years of service. So if a child must feel valued to value others and must experience empathy themselves to demonstrate empathy to others, as Carl Rogers argued, there's also the implication that teachers need to feel valued in order to transmit values and empathy to their students. one of the reasons teachers feel undervalued are the long hours, low pay, and precarity that many teachers endure. We know that if workers are overworked, stressed, and tired, this has a negative impact on their capacity to empathize. In many countries, language teachers in the private sector often have several employers, limited job security, sick pay and holiday pay, and low hourly rates. In the public sector, pay and conditions for teachers are getting worse with entrenched underfunding and the move towards privatization. The solution certainly involves teachers becoming members of local unions or forming one, if one doesn't already exist, in order to try to protect and improve their rights, pay and conditions, and fight for compensation when schools close, as ELT teachers in Dublin, London and Barcelona are doing, and you can see in these articles here. But perhaps it also involves teachers organizing themselves collectively, as Philip Kerr and Andrew Wickham suggest here. A successful example of collective organization is Cooperativa Serveis Linguístics de Barcelona, a cooperative set up by teachers in Barcelona who offer language classes, teacher training courses, translation and services for language professionals. Another factor that may make it challenging to embed a culture of empathy in language teaching is the poor mental health of many language teachers. Research shows that people who have poor mental health may find it more difficult to empathize with other people. In a 2020 UK study by the charity Education Support, 31% of teachers said that they'd experienced a mental health problem in the past academic year. And 84% of teachers described themselves as stressed or very stressed. And 74% of teachers had considered leaving the profession due to pressures on their health and well-being. And I feel that language teachers may be even more susceptible to poor mental health because of the poor working conditions we explored earlier. Phil Longwell is a teacher I admire very much for his bravery, honesty, and openness about his mental health issues. In 2017, Phil carried out research into the causes of and possible solutions to poor mental health in English language teaching. In the qualitative part of his study, teachers wrote about their experience of poor mental health in the staff room and classroom. And here you have two examples. And here you have two examples. As you can see, both teachers talk about poor working conditions and precarity as causes of poor mental health. And I believe that schools are at least partly responsible for their teachers' mental well-being and can do to improve conditions. So finally, we're going to turn to how we can foster empathy in our classrooms. One way for trainee teachers, teachers and trainers to become more empathic is to keep a reflective journal, to reflect on the perspective of colleagues and students, and to record every time they notice an instance of themselves, a student or colleague, being empathic. Reflecting on a diversity of perspectives is important, as teachers need to be able to have empathy for all students and colleagues, not just the with the to empathize. This technique comes from cognitive behavioral therapy and helps us realize that empathy is there if we consciously look for it. As empathy is promoted whenever we focus on the human experience, when we read a novel, when we act in a play, when we look at a painting, or when we watch a film, we're going to explore how the arts and perspective-taking activities can be used to foster empathy among students. The use of drama and role plays is especially effective method for fostering empathy. Given that role play is a familiar type of activity in many communicative language teaching classrooms, it's relatively easy to adapt tasks to focus on empathy. However, we need to give students time to prepare their role and get into the character. These empathy fostering questions, such as what kinds of things do you think they like and dislike? What and who do they care about or worry about, help students to get into their character by empathizing with their character. So we can give these questions to students for homework, and in the following class they perform their role play, and the role play is much more effective because students have empathized with their students, with their character. As much of fiction focuses on the psychology of characters and their relationship, it helps to extend empathy. So I think we should encourage students to read fiction, and perhaps especially young adult fiction, about people different from them and people from marginalized groups. After reading a novel, a short story, or reader, we can ask students to reflect on these empathy raising questions, such as how would you feel if you were that person, and what would you have done in that situation, which focus on the psychology of characters. We can also show films about people who are very different from our learners and about marginalized people. We could get them to watch this short film called Ali's Story, which tells the story of a young Afghan boy who has to flee his country because of war and becomes a refugee in Britain. Then we can ask students to discuss these empathy raising questions, such as how do you think Ali might be feeling? How do you know? What led Ali to make that choice? Another way of taking someone else's perspective is to make the imaginative leap into the life of another through the use of art. So we could show students a painting or photo such as the one we have here, and give them a perspective taking instruction, such as imagine a day in the life of this individual as if you were that person, looking at the world through her eyes and walking through the world in her shoes. And finally, a number of visible thinking routines, which are developed at Project Zero of the Harvard Graduate School of Education, can be used to foster empathy. One such routine is the step inside, perceive, know about, care about routine. And this routine asks students to step inside the role of a character from a picture they're looking at, a short film they've watched, or a story they've read, and to imagine themselves inside that point of view. Students then speak or write from that chosen point of view. And there are three core questions that guide this routine. What can the person perceive? What might the person know about or believe? And what might the person care about? And we could use it with an image such as this, and get students to discuss the question. So it's an excellent way of getting students to empathize with a character. So just to finish, just a few concluding thoughts. Language teachers have got great commitment to what they do. They work incredibly hard and extremely long hours. If we provided the conditions which were conducive to empathy and allowed it to flourish, we'd probably see happier teachers and students and more effective language learning. Post-pandemic education requires huge amounts of empathy and compassion, and teachers need the right conditions to provide this empathy and compassion. And they need training in social and emotional intelligence as well. And when the inevitable reimagining of education comes, let's reimagine how we can optimize language learning. But as an integral part of this, let's also reimagine entrenched underfunding, and let's reimagine teachers' pay and conditions. And just finally, I'd just like to end by going back to Earl Stevick's dictum, which I looked at in my introduction. And I believe that the harmony which Stevick refers to, perhaps this can only be achieved in the language classroom, the language staff room, in the whole teaching profession through empathy. So thank you very much for your attention, and thank you for attending the session. And thank you again to the British Council Mexico for inviting me to do this plenary. It's been a pleasure and an honor.